Sienna God, hello all. This afternoon, good afternoon, Wado. Thank you for watching. So this is day one of reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell, part B. Manliness and the foreseeable projection of the manliness to others and advertising of one's willingness to fight and even to put one's life on the line, or at least plausible means of gaining whatever measure of the security was possible in a lawless region in a violent time. The kinds of attitudes and cultural values produced by centuries of living under such conditions did not disappear very quickly. Even when social evolution in North America slowly and almost imperceptibly created a new and different world with different objective prospects. What the rednecks or crackers brought with them across the ocean was a whole constellation of attitudes, values, and behavior patterns that might have made sense in the world in which they had lived for centuries, but which would prove to be counterproductive in the world to which they were going, and counterproductive to the blacks who would live in their midst for centuries before emerging into freedom and migrating to the great urban centers of the United States, taking with them similar values. The cultural values and social patterns prevalent among Southern whites included an aversion to work, proneness to violence, neglect of education, sexual promiscuity, improvidence, drunkenness, lack of entrepreneurship, reckless searches for excitement, lively music and dance, and a style of a religious oratory marked by strident rhetoric, unbridled emotions, and flamboyant imagery. Doesn't seem like it was shed, does it? The oratorical style carried over into the political oratory of the region in both the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights era, and has continued on into our own times among black politicians, preachers, and activists. Touchy pride, vanity, and boastful self-dramatization were also part of this redneck culture among people from regions of Britain, in quotes, where the civilization was the least developed, end quote, and then quote again, they boast a lack of self-restraint, Olmsted said after observing their descendants in the American antebellum South. While Professor Grady McWhiney's cracker culture, and his last name is McWhiney, is perhaps the most thorough historical study of the values and behavioral patterns of white Southerners. Many other scholarly studies have turned up very similar patterns, even when they differed in some ways as to the causes. Professor David Hackett, Hackett, Fisher's, Fischer, Albion's seed, Albion seed, SEED, for example, challenges the Celtic connection thesis put forth by Professor McWhiney, but shows many of the same cultural patterns among the same people, both in Britain and in the American South. Popular writings of the 19th and 20th centuries have likewise described similar behavior, including the Indianapolis residents' comments on white Southern migrants to that city, which sound so much like what many have said about ghetto blacks. None of this is meant to claim that these patterns have remained rigidly unchanged over the centuries, or that there are literally no differences between whites and blacks in any aspect of this subculture. However, what is remarkable is how pervasive and how close the similarities have been. I mean, it's been striking so far, I'm just saying. Pride and violence. Centuries before quote-unquote black pride became a fashionable phrase, there was cracker pride. And it is very much the same kind of pride. It was not pride in any particular achievement or set of behavioral standards or moral principles adhered to. It was instead a touchiness about anything that might be even remotely construed as a personal slight, much less an insult, combined with a willingness to erupt into violence over it. New Englanders were baffled about this kind of pride among crackers. Observing such people, the Yankees, in quotes, could not understand what they had to feel proud about, end quote. However, this kind of pride is perhaps best illustrated by an episode reported in Professor McWhiney's cracker culture. When an Englishman, tired of waiting for a Southerner to start working on a house he had contracted to build, hired another man to do the job. The enraged Southerner, who considered himself dishonored, vowed, in quotes, "Tomorrow morn I will come with men and 20 rifles, and I will have your life, or you shall have mine," end quote. Kind of still going on, ain't it? In the vernacular of our later times, he had been, quote unquote, dissed, and he was not going to stand for it regardless of the consequences for himself or others. The history of the antebellum South is full of episodes showing the same pattern, whether expressed in the highly formalized duels of the aristocracy or in the no-holds-barred style of fighting called, quote-unquote, rough and tumble. Among the common folk, a style that included biting off ears and gouging out eyes. Come on, y'all. It was not simply that particular isolated individuals did such things. Social approval was given to these practices as illustrated by the episode in the antebellum South. A crowd gathered and arranged itself in an impromptu ring. The contestants were asked if they wished to quote-unquote fight fair or quote-unquote rough and tumble. When they chose quote-unquote rough and tumble, a roar of approval rose from the multitude. This particular fight ended with the loser's nose bitten off, his ears torn off, and both his eyes gouged out, after which, in quotes, Victor, himself maimed and bleeding, was chaired round the grounds to the cheers of the crowd, end quote. This, quote-unquote, rough and tumble style of fighting was also popular in the southern highlands of Scotland, where grabbing an opponent's testicles and attempting to castrate him by hand was also an accepted practice. Scottish Highlanders were in centuries past part of the quote-unquote Celtic fringe, or quote-unquote North Britons, Britons, outside the orbit of English culture, not only as it existed in England but also in the Scottish lowlands. The Highlanders lagged far behind the lowlanders in education and economic progress, as well as in the speaking of the English language, for Gaelic was still widely spoken by Highlanders in the 19th century, not only in Scotland itself, but also in North Carolina and in Australia, where immigrants from the Scottish Highlands were unable to communicate with English-speaking people, including lowland Scots who had also immigrated. In the Hebrides Islands, Hebrides, of Scotland, Gaelic had still not completely died out in the middle of the 20th century. What is important in the pride and violence patterns among rednecks and crackers was not that particular people did particular things at particular times and places, nor is it necessary to attempt to quantify such behavior. What is crucial is that violence growing out of such pride had social approval. Social approval, as Professor McWhinney pointed out. I don't know, is it McWhinney? I'm not sure. Men often killed and went free in the South, just as in earlier times they had in Ireland and Scotland. As one observer in the South noted, enemies would meet, exchange insults, and one would shoot the other down, professing that he had acted in self-defense because he believed the victim was armed. When such a story was told in court, in quotes, in a community where it is not a strange thing for men to carry about their persons deadly weapons, in brackets, each member of the jury, in brackets, feels that he would have done the same thing under similar circumstances, so that in condemning him, they would but condemn themselves, end quote. In quotes, the actions of Southern courts often amazed outsiders, end quote, Professor McWhinney said. But what may be even more revealing of widespread attitudes were the cases that never even went to trial. As another study of white Southerners put it, to many rural Southerners, rather than a set of legal statutes, justice remained a matter of societal norms, allowing for respect of property rights, individual honor, and a maximum of personal independence. Any violation of this pattern amounted to a breach of justice requiring a specific response from the injured party. Upon learning that a youthful neighbor had approached his wife in an overly friendly manner, Robert Leard, L-E-A-R-D, of Tangipahoa, Tangipahoa, Louisiana, I don't know how to pronounce that, promptly tracked the young man down and killed him. Under the Piney Woods Code of Justice, anything less would have invited shame and ridicule upon the Leard family. In quotes, intensity of personal pride, end quote, was connected by Olmsted, Olmsted, with the, in quotes, fiend-like street fights of the South, end quote. He mentioned in an episode of Public Murder with Impunity, a gentleman of veracity, now living in the South, told me that among his friends he had once numbered 2 young men who were themselves intimate friends till one of them, taking offense at some foolish words uttered by the other, challenges him. A large crowd assembled to see the duel, which took place on a piece of prairie ground. The combatants came armed with rifles. Over words, y'all. And at the first interchange of shots, the challenged man fell disabled by a ball in the thigh. The other, throwing down his rifle, walked toward him and, kneeling by his side, drew a bowie knife and deliberately butchered him. The crowd of bystanders not only permitted this, but the execrable, execrable assassination still lives in the community, has since married, and as far as my informant could judge, his social position has been rather advanced than otherwise from thus dealing with his enemy. Okay, again, what is important here is not the isolated incident itself, but the set of social attitudes which allowed such incidents to take place publicly with impunity. The killer knowing in advance that what he was doing had community approval. How many cases? How many GoFundMes? There's one currently, right? The community thinks it's fine, it's okay. But the law says he broke it, right? But they think the law is one-sided. It ain't. All right, anyway. Moreover, such attitudes went back for centuries on both sides of the Atlantic, at least among the particular people concerned. During the era when dueling became a pattern among upper-class Americans between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, it was particularly prevalent in the South. A social history of the United States noted, in quotes, of Southern statesmen who rose to prominence after 1790, hardly one can be mentioned who was not involved in a duel, end quote. Editors of Southern newspapers became involved in duels so often that cartoonists depicted them with a pen in one hand and a dueling pistol in the other. Most duels arose not over substantive SUBSTANTIVE issues, but over words considered insulting. At lower social levels, Southern feuds, such as that between the Hatfields and the McCoys, which began in a dispute over a pig and ultimately claimed more than 20 lives, became legendary. Yeah, they even made a series about it, and it was really good and it was really crazy. And what I mean by good is that it was captivating, right? But it's crazy because it was like real. You know what I'm saying? It has been estimated that while at least 3/4 of the settlers in colonial New England originated in the lowlands, southeastern half of Britain, a similarly large proportion of the population of the South originated in the Scottish Highlands, Ireland, Wales, or the northern and western uplands of England. Those arriving from Ireland in colonial times would have been from Ulster County, Ulster, where Scots and Englishmen settled, since substantial immigration of the indigenous Irish did not begin until near the middle of the 19th century. Radically different cultures could develop and persist during this era before the transportation and communication developed to the point of promoting widespread interactions among people in different regions. In colonial America, the people of the English borderlands and of the quote-unquote Celtic fringe were seen by contemporaries as culturally quite distinct and were socially unwelcome. Okay? They didn't want them there. Most action prevented a shipload of Ulster Scots from landing in Boston in 1719, and the Quaker leaders of eastern Pennsylvania encouraged Ulster Scots to settle out in western Pennsylvania because they were like heathenists, you know what I'm saying? Where they acted as a buffer to the Indians, as well as being a constant source of friction and conflict with the Indians. It was not just in the North that crackers and rednecks were considered to be undesirables. Southern plantation owners with poor whites living on adjoining land would often offer to buy their land for more than it was worth in order to be rid of such neighbors. So they would literally stick people, like, think about it today, right? They just stick the people, the ghetto people, in between the Indians as a buffer between them and the civilized people. Like, think about that. That's crazy town banana pants. And then the ghetto people would bother the Indians, you know? And people think that it was only ever one race, right? Come on now. Because there were no racial differences to form separate statistical categories for these North Britons, Britons, and for other whites who settled in the South or in particular enclaves. And the reason why I'm saying Britons is because that's how it's written. But when they say, you know, Britons and whatever else, and I don't say it, it's written the norm, like the regular way that we're used to, Britains. Anyway, and for other whites who settled in the South or in particular in enclaves, elsewhere, indirect indicators must serve as proxies for these cultural differences. Names are among these indicators. Edward, for example, was a popular name in Virginia and in Wessex, England, from which many Virginians had immigrated. But the first 40 classes of undergraduates at Harvard College contained only one man named Edward. It would be nearly 2 centuries before Harvard enrolled anyone named Patrick, even though that was a common name in western Pennsylvania. Where the Ulster Scots settled, this says something not only about the social and geographic differences of the times, but also about how regionalized the naming patterns were then, in contrast to the fact that no one today finds it particularly strange when an Asian American has such non-Asian first names as Kevin or Michelle. Even where there was no conflict or hostility involved, Southerners often showed a reckless disregard for human life, including their own. For example, the racing of steamboats that happened to encounter each other on the rivers of the South often ended with exploding boilers, especially when the excited competition led to the tying down of safety valves in order to build up more pressure to generate more speed. An impromptu race between steamboats that encountered each other on the Mississippi illustrates the pattern. On board one boat, quote unquote, was an old lady who, having bought a winter stock of bacon, pork, and there's a period there, and was returning to her home on the banks of the Mississippi. Fun lovers on board both boats insisted upon a race. Cheers and drawn pistols obliged the captains to cooperate. As the boats struggled, so they essentially took the boats over. They stole the boats, right? Hijacked the boats or whatever. As the boats struggled to outdistance each other, excited passengers demanded more speed. Despite every effort, the boats raced evenly until the old lady directed her slaves to throw all her casks of bacon into the boilers. Her boat then moved ahead of the other vessel, which suddenly exploded. End quote. Clouds of splinters and human limbs darkened the sky. End quote. On the undamaged boat, passengers shouted their victory, but above their cheers could, end quotes, be heard the shrill voice of the old lady crying, I did it, it's all my bacon, end quote. That's crazy. On the Mississippi and other quote unquote western rivers of the United States as it existed in the early 19th century, it has been estimated that 30% of all the steamboats were lost in accidents. Part of this may have been due to deficiencies in the early steamboats themselves, but much of it was due to the recklessness which they were operated on southern rivers. The comments of a fireman on a Mississippi steamboat of that era may suggest why a river voyage was considered more dangerous than crossing the Atlantic, at a time when sinkings in the Atlantic were by no means rare. And I will just see if I can get through this paragraph real fast. It said, his end quotes, talk about northern steamers. The fireman of a Mississippi steamboat sneered to an Eastern traveler in 1844. It don't need no spunk to navigate them waters. You hain't bust a biller in 5 years, but I tell you, stranger, it takes a man to ride one of these half-alligator boats, head on a snag, high pressures, valve soldered down, 600 souls on board, and in danger of going to the devil, end quote. Don't they go hang you, you ain't a good chance to me again, love you, mean it.